Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. It was supposed to be a reset. I've been stretched thin between projects, deadlines piling up, tension in my chest so tight I could barely breathe some mornings. My brother had been inviting me for months to come out to his cabin. Nothing fancy, just peace, fishing, and no cell signal strong enough to let stress follow me. I finally took him up on it. Told Jessica I needed a break, just for a few days. She'd smile with that usual sweet polish she always wore. "You deserve it," she said, pressing a kiss to my cheek. "I'll hold the fort down." The house was in order when I left. Clean, quiet. Our schedule was synced, and her mother was due for a weekend visit while I was gone. "I might get a little stir-crazy," she joked, "but I'll survive." The trip was perfect. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. No vibrating alerts. Just the sound of wind rustling pine needles and my brother's snoring through the wall. I came back 3 days later with a clear head and a full cooler of bass. But as soon as I stepped through the front door, something itched under my skin. At first, it was just little things. The hallway air smelled faintly like cologne I didn't recognize. Not the kind I wore. The guest blanket, usually folded neatly at the foot of the couch, was wadded and stuffed behind a chair. Jessica claimed she'd spilled wine and didn't want it to stain the carpet. Fair enough. I let it go. But the next morning, when I went to water the fern near the window, I noticed one of the security cameras I'd mounted last year was slightly off its bracket, tilted upward like someone had bumped it. Jessica hadn't mentioned anything about it. When I asked, she said she didn't even know it moved. I adjusted it without saying more, but the thought lingered. I tried to shake it. Told myself I was being paranoid. But it kept building like a hum I couldn't hear, but could feel beneath my skin. She seemed distant, not in a dramatic way, just distracted, checking her phone a bit too often, going to bed earlier than usual. Laughing at jokes I wasn't on when texting someone who never appeared by name on her notifications. I didn't accuse. I didn't even hint. I just watched, listened, gathered. Then I installed the camera. It was a quiet decision. No storm, no anger, just clarity. I told her I was rearranging my workspace and needed the extra gear. She didn't question it. I mounted the lens above the closet trim, facing the bedroom. Subtle, hidden. It wasn't even meant to catch her doing anything wrong. At first, it was just for my own peace of mind. But peace never came. She kept acting normal, which only made it worse. Her smiles didn't feel real anymore. Her touch, when it came, felt rehearsed. And every time her phone lit up, she tilted it slightly away. Then came the weekend. Her mother, Linda, and her stepfather, Doug, came over as planned. I said my goodbyes, packed the truck again, and headed out for a single overnight visit to check in on a work site 2 towns over. I texted Jessica goodnight, received a casual reply, and nothing more. I got back the next evening. Jessica was waiting with takeout and a bottle of wine. "I figured you'd be tired," she said. "Just relax tonight." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think everything was fine, that I was the one with the problem, that I was inventing shadows. But after she fell asleep, I slipped in my office, pulled up the camera feed from the night before, and hit play. And that's when everything changed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there, eyes locked to the screen, listening to her laugh, listening to her whisper. She always falls asleep with a glass of wine. We'll be done before she notices. The voice that answered didn't belong to who I expected. Not even close. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, hands clenched around the armrests, staring at the paused video frame. Jessica's hand gripping the doorknob, her eyes bright, and that grin on her face like she was sharing a joke no one else was in on. The voice that responded to her. It wasn't someone I ever expected to hear in that context. But the angle was off. I couldn't see the man. Just a sliver of his arm as he followed her into the bedroom. Then the door closed. I didn't watch the rest. Not yet. I needed to think, not burn myself in the fire. The next morning, I went through the motions. Poured her coffee. She smiled and thanked me, kissed my cheek, and talked about trying a new dinner recipe that night. I nodded like I was listening, but my mind was elsewhere. That voice wasn't familiar, not completely, but it also wasn't totally foreign. I'd heard it before, just not in that setting, not filtered through that low, conspiratorial tone. I waited until she left for a hair appointment before I reviewed the footage again. My stomach turned with every second. The timestamp lined up perfectly with when I'd been out of town. Jessica opened the bedroom door. She was whispering something and giggling under her breath. "She always falls asleep with a glass of wine," she said again, quieter this time. "We'll be done before she notices." The voice responded, low and amused. "Then let's not waste time." "Doug?" "No, it couldn't be." I shook the thought off. The camera didn't catch much more. Their backs were to the lens. Jessica pulled the curtains shut. That was it. Black screen. Audio continued faintly, but nothing conclusive. I needed confirmation. I needed more than a shadow and a voice. I needed a name. So I started watching. Not just the footage. Her behavior. Her movements. Her phone. That night, we had dinner with her friend Courtney and her husband Tyler. I'd known Tyler for years. Decent guy, bit of a bragger, always talking about investments and real estate, but loyal to a fault. Jessica seemed unusually nervous around him that night. She laughed too loudly at his jokes, touched his arm twice when making a point about something completely unimportant. My radar lit up. After dinner, she said she wanted to stay behind and help Courtney clean up. I said I'd get the car. Instead, I walked to the backyard and waited by the fence. It wasn't long before I heard hushed voices. "Jessica," and a man. "I didn't think you'd actually show up tonight," she whispered. "Why wouldn't I?" the man replied. "That's all I needed." My heart was hammering as I stepped back toward the house, thinking I was about to catch them red-handed. I pushed open the patio door and walked into the kitchen. Jessica stood by the sink with Courtney, laughing about wine glasses. Tyler walked in from the garage, wiping his hands with a rag. "Sorry, just had to check the water softener. Things been acting up." I blinked, looked at Jessica. She raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, thought I left my phone out here." They didn't act suspicious. And that voice, maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't Tyler after all. Maybe I was hearing what I wanted to hear. I told myself I needed to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Later that night, Jessica curled in a bed beside me like nothing had happened. "You were quiet tonight," she said. "Tired, just thinking," I replied. "About work?" "Something like that." She kissed my shoulder and turned over. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I went through her drawers. Not out of spite, out of necessity. I needed something tangible, but there was nothing. No notes, no extra phones, no receipts, just a normal mess of lotions, jewelry, a few old cards, and receipts from months ago. I started wondering if I'd made it all worse by jumping to conclusions, until I checked the trash can in the guest bathroom. Beneath the tissue and wrappers, there was a receipt, folded in half, crumpled like it had been thrown out quickly. I pulled it out, smoothed it on the counter. It was from a boutique downtown. High-end men's cologne. Gift-wrapped. Paid in cash. I stared at it for a full minute. Jessica hadn't mentioned buying any gifts lately. There were no birthdays coming up. No holidays. And certainly no reason to hide it from me. But she had. The date matched the day I left for my brother's. And suddenly, the doubt evaporated. I wasn't wrong. Just early. But Tyler wasn't the one I needed to watch. And deep down, I think I already knew that. I kept the receipt. Not in a drawer or folder, but in my wallet, right behind my license where it could dig into me every time I reached for something. I wanted the reminder. Every glance at it reminded me this wasn't about paranoia anymore. This was real. She bought a gift for another man while I was away. Paid in cash. Wrapped it. Disposed of the evidence like it never happened. But she didn't throw it away far enough. That mistake changed everything. The next step wasn't anger. I didn't confront her, didn't accuse, didn't let her see the war building behind my eyes. Instead, I waited until she left for her usual Sunday market trip. She was gone 2 hours. More than enough time. I knew she kept gifts in the upper closet storage bins. One of those semi-transparent plastic containers labeled occasionals in sharp black marker. I pulled it down carefully and pried off the lid. There it was, wrapped in thick silver paper with a navy ribbon tied in a tight loop. The boutique label still clinging to the edge. I lifted it gently. The weight felt too specific for a candle or socks. I peeled back just enough of the corner to expose the edge of a box, sleek, black, and marked with the brand of that cologne I'd seen on the receipt. I replaced the wrapping slowly, cleanly. Then I got to work. In the garage, I found an old bottle of grocery store aftershave I'd been given years ago. Something pungent and cheap with a scent that could clear a room. I cleaned out the original cologne bottle, rinsed it, dried it, and refilled it with a knockoff. Then I carefully placed it back into the box, resealed the wrapping, and tucked the gift back into the storage bin, undisturbed. She wouldn't notice. Not yet. That part wasn't for her. It was for him, whoever he was. Later that evening, she was cheerful, set the table, cooked her favorite lemon chicken, poured 2 glasses of wine without asking. I played along, asked about her day, complimented the meal. She leaned across the table at one point and said, "You've been different lately." In a good way, more relaxed. I smiled. Maybe the trip helped. She nodded, sipping. "You should do that more often." There it was. A crack. She wanted me away. I didn't bite. Instead, I started watching patterns. She had picked up new habits, checking the mail before I could get to it, locking her phone more religiously, taking more frequent showers at odd hours. She used to leave her phone charging on the nightstand. Now it stayed face down in her purse. When she left the room, the bag followed. But the one shift that stood out most, she started dressing better at night. Not for me, for someone. I stayed up late a few nights in a row, pretending to fall asleep on the couch while she claimed exhaustion and disappeared into the bedroom. Each time, she'd crack the window open just slightly, check her reflection longer than usual, then slide under the covers fully dressed, phone in hand, screen glowing faintly under the blankets. Once I heard her laugh, a short, private laugh. Not when she gave me any more. I needed more. So I planted another camera, this one smaller, near the window ledge behind a decorative vase. It had motion detection, no blinking light. I tested it myself, walking in and out, watching the footage loop cleanly. It would activate only when there was movement. That week, I kept acting normal. I suggested a movie night. She said she had a headache. I offered to cook. She ordered takeout for one. By Saturday, I stopped asking. Let her plan her day without interruptions. That night, while she was upstairs, I opened the laptop and scanned the new camera files. One file had a time stamp from the night before. She'd been pacing by the window, phone to her ear. "I know, but not here," she said. "I'll bring it when the timing's right." She paused, nodding to someone I couldn't see. I already told her it was a birthday gift. She won't question it. That stopped me. Told her, was the gift not for a man? I rewound, played it again, slower, still the same line. She wasn't referring to me. That much was obvious. But who was her? Was it her sister? Her friend? Her mother? I froze. The thought hit me like a gut punch. Her mother was visiting again next weekend. The same mother who always drank too much wine and fell asleep by 9. The same mother who always insisted on staying overnight. I didn't want to believe it, not even for a second, but I knew something was coming. Something I wasn't supposed to see, but I would. It's amazing how quickly suspicion can turn into obsession. One seed of doubt, and suddenly everything looks like evidence. A laugh too sharp, a text message typed a little too quickly, a glance away just before she answers a question. I told myself I was being careful, methodical, but I was unraveling quietly and efficiently behind my calm expression. Jessica had no idea. That was the only comfort I had left. The following week, I started noticing a new pattern. A name, repeated in passing, casually dropped in his stories. Eric, her co-worker. He hadn't been in her conversations before. Not that I remembered, but now he was everywhere. Eric said the meeting was a disaster. Eric brought in bagels again. Everyone's going to blame him when the office gains weight. Eric's getting married soon. Poor guy doesn't even know what's coming. I asked her once, "You mention him a lot lately." She looked up from her phone, blinked. "Who? Eric? Oh, yeah. He's just funny. Kind of like the class clown, but 35. She said it casually, with no shift in her tone. Nothing defensive, but something still twitched in me. I knew what I heard in the footage. That voice. Low, confident, almost smug. And the more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that it was Eric. I began piecing it together, inventing timelines. She worked late on Mondays. He was always there, she said. She had drinks after work on Thursdays with some of the team. He'd be on that team. I knew it, so I set a trap. I told her I had to leave town again, one night only. Another work trip, same cover as before. I kissed her goodbye in the driveway and pulled out, looped the block, and parked a few streets over. I waited for the sun to drop and the street lights to flicker on. I watched the house. The windows stayed dark, curtains drawn. Her car never moved. Around 9, a figure approached the porch. Tall, broad, hair slicked back. My chest tightened. I raised the small digital camera, zoomed in. The figure knocked once, then twice in a rhythmic beat. The door opened. Jessica stood there in yoga pants and a loose tee, hair down. She didn't invite him in right away. They spoke for a few minutes, then she stepped aside. He entered. The door closed. I didn't rush the footage. I waited, gave it 30 minutes, then circled back and entered through the rear, quiet as a ghost. I disabled the chime on the door earlier in the week. She had no idea. I crept through the kitchen, past the living room, up the stairs. At the top, I paused. Voices. Not moaning, not whispering, just talking. Calm. Laughter, even. I raised the camera, pressed record, and stepped toward the door. I took a breath, turned the handle slowly, pushed it open. Jessica sat at the desk, holding a folder. The man sat on the edge of the bed. It wasn't Eric. It was her cousin, Darren. They both jumped. Mark, Jessica said, standing. What are you? I raised a hand. Save it. Darren stood too. This isn't what you think, man. No, I asked, because it sure looked like something from outside. Jessica grabbed my arm. Mark, he's helping me plan Mom's anniversary party. It's a surprise. Darren nodded, pulling out the folder. Seriously, this is the caterer list. We've been working on it for weeks. I stared at the papers. Photos of venues. Sample menus. A guest list. Jessica stepped closer. Why would you sneak back like this? I said nothing. My heart was still racing, but the logic was unrolling before me. She wasn't cheating, not with Darren. And that voice on the footage, it wasn't his. I felt something cold spread in my gut. The realization that I'd been wrong. That I'd built an entire structure of blame on the wrong man. Jessica looked hurt now. Not angry, disappointed. If you had questions, you should have asked. I didn't think I needed to, I said. Darren gathered the folder. I'll give you 2 a minute, he muttered, slipping past me. I stood there, in a house that suddenly felt too quiet, staring at my wife, wondering how far off course I'd veered. She walked to the window, arms crossed. You really thought I'd cheat with my cousin? I thought something was going on, I said. You've been distant. She shook her head. I've been planning a surprise. I've been trying to do something nice. And for a second, I believed her. We stood in silence, long and brittle. I wanted to apologize, but something held me back. Some part of me still whispered. This wasn't over. Something was still off. Jessica turned. Please don't do this again. I nodded. I won't, but I knew I would, because deep down, I knew this chapter was closed. But the story wasn't over. Not even close. I told myself to stop. After the disaster with Darren, after standing in my own hallway like a trespasser in my marriage, I told myself I needed to let go. That idea let my doubts run wild and nearly destroyed the last thread of trust we had. Jessica didn't mention the incident again. She didn't bring up my late return, didn't ask why I had come home early, didn't ask what I thought I'd seen. That silence alone should have soothed me, but it didn't. It only made the air heavier between us, like she was dodging something she didn't want to name. The following week, I buried myself in work, stayed out later, came home exhausted, and did everything I could to convince myself I'd been wrong. We talked more, laughed a little even. She started sitting beside me again on the couch instead of the far end, and for a moment, it felt like maybe I'd overreached and my guilt was settling into something close to peace. But peace is a way of slipping through the cracks when you stare too long. It started with the garage. One evening I pulled in, headlights washing over the back wall where I always left my tool chest, and something was off. Subtle, but the top drawer wasn't fully shut, even though I always pressed it in until I heard the click. I stepped out of the car, walked over, and slid it open. The lockpick kit was missing. Not the whole box, just the tools I kept hidden under the foam. I'd bought them years ago during a phase when I thought I'd teach myself safe cracking for fun. They weren't valuable, and they'd been untouched for ages. But now they were gone. I asked her casually over dinner. Did you move anything in the garage? Jessica didn't look up from her plate. No, why? Just something looked out of place. She nodded. You always know when something's moved. It's like you got a sixth sense for disorder. She said it with a smile, but there was a flicker in her eyes. That night, I checked the garage camera. It hadn't recorded anything unusual, no triggers, but it only covered the entrance, not the workbench, not the corner where the chest stood. And I realized something then. She was learning, watching me as closely as I'd been watching her. The next clue came unexpectedly. Her phone lit up on the nightstand while she was in the shower. I didn't touch it, just glanced. One notification, a reminder, Saturday, 3 p.m., set it up before Elle leaves. Elle, her mother, Linda, was arriving that weekend for another overnight stay. Same pattern. Jessica made sure the wine was stocked. She placed fresh towels in the guest bathroom, lit candles in the hallway like we were hosting royalty. But I noticed something new this time. She avoided the master bedroom all day. Usually, she'd toss laundry on the bed or touch up the pillows before guests arrived. But this time, she never crossed the threshold, like she didn't want to disturb something. Saturday came. Jessica was unusually restless, kept glancing at the clock, checking her phone in intervals. I offered to go run errands, give her space to prep. She agreed too quickly. I left, circled the neighborhood, and parked 2 streets over. I watched from a distance, engine off, phone in hand. At 2:55, a car pulled into the driveway. Doug stepped out. Her stepfather. I didn't understand at first. Maybe he was dropping something off. Maybe he came early with Linda. But Linda wasn't with him. I leaned forward in the seat, pulse thudding against the silence. He rang the bell. Jessica opened the door, smiling. She let him in, closed the door, and I sat there. 15 minutes passed, then 20, then 30. I got out of the car and walked back, slow and deliberate, mind racing. I didn't barge in. Not yet. I went around the side and checked the window. Closed. Curtains drawn. I looked for the camera angle in the bedroom. Still active. Still recording. But I didn't open the feed yet. I needed to see her face first. While I walked through the front door, Jessica was in the kitchen, alone, wiping down the counter. Hey, she said, a little breathless. I thought you were out until dinner. I forgot my wallet, I lied. Oh, she smiled too big. Everything okay? Yeah, just a lot on my mind. She turned, rinsed the cloth. Well, your mom should be here soon. She'd said your mom. A slip. Linda wasn't my mother. She wasn't flustered, but she was too calm. The house didn't smell like food or wine, just faintly like cologne that wasn't mine. I stared at the hallway, and for the first time, I didn't feel wrong. I felt like I was finally standing in the right spot, the edge of the truth. I didn't confront her that day, didn't storm down the hall, didn't tear open the bedroom door or shout accusations. That wasn't the point anymore. I'd been wrong once, called it too early, and the humiliation of that mistake still echoed. I wasn't going to swing wildly again. This time, I'd catch her right. Not just catch her, prove it. Lock it down in images and audio and timing. I wanted a truth so airtight that not even she could lie her way through it. Because whatever she was hiding, she had gotten good at hiding it. And I was done giving her the benefit of the doubt. I waited for Linda to arrive. I stood at the window and watched her car pull up. Jessica met her at the door like nothing had happened. Smiling, hugging, laughing. I sat on the living room couch, pretending to scroll my phone while behind my eyes, everything was calculation. I didn't even speak much through dinner. Jessica did most of the talking, which wasn't new. Doug arrived an hour later, carrying a bottle of red and a bag of groceries. He always brought something, wine, meat, snacks, but this time he barely glanced at me as he stepped through the door. I paid attention to everything. His shoes, his posture, Jessica's tone. At one point, she touched his arm in the kitchen. Light, brief, like it meant nothing. But it didn't feel like nothing. Not anymore. After dinner, Linda went upstairs early, wine in hand. She always turned in by 10. Jessica followed shortly after, claiming she had to help set up the guest room. Doug stayed behind, sipping slowly from his second glass of wine, watching a rerun of some nature show. I stayed up too, watching him, watching the clock. 10:30 came, then 11. I rose from the chair, stretched. and said, "Heading to bed." Doug nodded without looking. Jessica was already in the bedroom, lights low, pretending to read a book. "You good?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just tired." She nodded. "I'll probably be asleep in 5. I kissed her forehead and turned toward the bathroom. Closed the door, waited 10 seconds, then crept back out, silent. I knew which floorboards creaked. I bypassed them like a ghost, slipped into my office, and opened the live feed from the camera tucked above the closet trim. At first, there was nothing, just shadows. Jessica lying back, book still in hand. Then movement. She got up, slid into a robe, tiptoed out. My heart was pounding, but I didn't feel panic, just confirmation. I followed her footsteps in silence, keeping my distance, back pressed to the wall. The master bedroom door clicked softly. I opened the feed again. She returned within a minute. Not alone. Doug. He entered slowly, speaking in a whisper I couldn't catch. Jessica laughed, the same quiet laugh from the first recording. She gestured toward the bed. Then I heard it again. Her voice. She always falls asleep with a glass of wine. We'll be done before she notices. The same line. Word for word. She wasn't talking about me. She was talking about Linda. I gritted my teeth, fist tightening over the mouse. So it was true. Doug, her stepfather, in our bedroom. Smiling like this was just another casual affair. Jessica stood beside him now, whispering something. He laughed, too close, too familiar. They didn't care about who might hear them anymore. They thought the house was sleeping, but it wasn't. I recorded the entire feed, saved it twice, backed it up to the cloud and a separate drive. I sat there, eyes locked to the screen, watching as my wife, betrayed everything under our roof. Her mother slept down the hall, a glass of wine likely still full on the nightstand. I didn't burst in. That's what they'd expect from a man like me. A husband with pride, with blood boiling. No, I wasn't giving them that release. I closed the laptop, locked the door behind me, went to the guest room and stared at the ceiling for hours. Thinking, planning, not just how to leave. That would be too easy for them. I wanted them to know exactly what they'd done. I wanted to hold a mirror to their faces and make them watch it shatter. The next morning, Jessica made eggs. Doug left early, saying he had errands to run before heading home. I acted like nothing had changed. Thanked her for breakfast, kissed her cheek, smiled when she told me she loved me. She smiled back. No one suspects the man who smiles. The silence that followed my words wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, a crushing stillness that made everyone hold their breath. Jessica stood there, eyes wide and glassy, as if the world had spun too fast and thrown her off balance. Doug hadn't moved. He was still slouched in his chair, one hand gripping the stem of his wine glass, knuckles white, lips slightly parted like he wanted to speak, but had forgotten how. Linda hadn't said a word. Her hands were clenched together in her lap, face pale, eyes darting from the screen to Jessica to me, and then back again. I didn't flinch. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. Jessica looked at the overnight bag I'd placed near the door. It was subtle, almost easy to miss, but when her eyes landed on it, the realization sank in fast. She took a step forward. "Mark," she said, voice low, trying to grasp for that careful tone she always used when she wanted control. "Let's talk about this. Privately." I turned to her, calm and unmoved. "No, there's nothing left to talk about privately. You had your chances for private conversations. You used them for something else." Her hands twitched. "You don't understand. I understand everything now," I said. "I understand the nights you smiled at me like nothing was wrong. I understand the weekends you planned around her visits. I understand the cheap cologne that lingered in my house. I understand the betrayal that walked through my front door every time you kissed your mother goodnight and crept into my bed." Doug finally stood. "Mark, listen, no," I snapped, eyes slicing toward him. "You don't get to speak." He sat back down. I turned back to Jessica. "The footage isn't going anywhere. It's already with my attorney. It's in the cloud. It's in a locked drive. If I never say another word about it, the evidence alone will say everything I need it to. I don't care what you tell your friends. I don't care what you tell your mother. But I will make sure every legal avenue available is pursued. I will make sure the truth is part of every conversation going forward." Linda finally rose, her legs trembling. Jessica, is this true? Jessica opened her mouth, stammered, and closed it again. She couldn't look at her. I stepped in. You want to sit down, Linda? It's all true. It's been happening. And it's not a rumor or a misunderstanding or a drunken lapse. It's routine. Jessica gasped. How could you do this in front of everyone? How could you do it in front of me? I said sharply. In my house. On my bed? With him. Doug stood again. I didn't mean don't finish that sentence, I warned. You meant every second. You meant it when you showed up. You meant it when you lied to your wife. You meant it when you stood in my doorway and smiled like you were still welcome here. You meant it. Jessica's breathing had turned shallow. Her arms were wrapped tightly across her chest now, voice shaking. You're ruining everything. No, I said coldly. You already did. I'm just shining a light on it. I handed her the car keys. Take him. Go. And don't come back. Doug hesitated. Mark, we can talk. I'm not your son-in-law anymore. He blinked. I turned to Jessica one last time. Whatever apology you're about to form in your throat, swallow it. You were never sorry. You were just scared you got caught. Her eyes brimmed with tears. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at Linda. Her mother didn't move. Jessica took a shaky step toward the door, reached for the handle, and paused. Please, no, I said. You don't get to beg now. She grabbed the bag without another word. Doug followed like a dog caught in a trap. They walked out in silence. I watched through the window as the car reversed from the driveway and disappeared into the night. The wind picked up slightly. Trees rustled. A siren whined in the distance. The ordinary sound of the world moving on while something inside the house fell permanently silent. Linda remained at the table, eyes fixed on her empty plate. I didn't know, she whispered. I know, I said, quieter now. You weren't the one I was watching. She nodded, slowly, tears sliding down her face. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize for her. She looked at me then, truly looked, and I saw the heartbreak ripple across her expression. Not just betrayal. Shame. Grief. I trusted her, she said. I raised her better. We didn't speak again that night. She stayed in the guest room. I stayed awake in mine, staring at the ceiling like I had for weeks, but this time not wondering, not doubting. This time it was over. In the morning, I packed the last of Jessica's things, what little remained. I loaded them into the trunk, drove them to a storage facility, and left the keys in her mailbox. I filed the paperwork 2 days later. And when the call came, Jessica, crying on the line, begging to explain, to talk, to rewind, I let it ring. Not out of vengeance, but because there was nothing left to say. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.